Welcome. I am John, and today we have Eric LeVine. He is the founder and CEO of CellarTracker. This is the world's largest wine community. It is also the place where I personally have my wine logged in. So, Eric was basically just doing a little personal project when he left Microsoft for a sabbatical in 2003. And now the platform has tens of millions of tasting notes, hundreds of millions of bottles tracked, and nearly 1 million users worldwide. But he found before he got into CellarTracker wine to be, quote, hopelessly intimidating. So he had a bike trip in the late 1990s through Tuscany, and he was having the trip of his life, so much so that for a personal project, he built this little tracker for inventory management. Well, now he is running kind of the preeminent software online for people to track their wine, but it's much more than that. It's a place to share tasting notes. It's a place to share likes and dislikes, and it's really developed in the community. Recently, he's added a lot of AI type features, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. This is Eric LeVine. So I am not just like a podcast interviewer. I'm also a member type of thing. So I've been using CellarTracker for years. I come at this from like the collector background, but what I'd love to hear from you a little bit before we even get into CellarTracker is just a little bit of that arc as kind of the nice Jewish boy like me, who might have had some exposure to wine. But talk to me a little bit about your youth growing up and like where wine even fit into that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so my dad, I remember he would always get the Wine Spectator. He would drink wine with most meals. Even when I was pretty young, maybe 10 or 11, I could always get a sip. I remember when we were doing like the celebration dinner after my bar mitzvah, having a Sauterne for the first time. I'd never tasted anything like that. And I was just like, wow, this is cool. And so it was kind of always, and I assume my dad knew a lot about wine. I think what I discovered later in life is he didn't actually know that much about wine, but there was a closet that had some wine in it, and he, in the basement, of course, and not really a cellar, but he was into it. And so that was part of it. And then, so it's just like one of those things, like I've always been very interested in food. I've got, everyone around me always says, oh, you've got a very good palate. Like I always order the best dish and I can describe things and whatever. So like wine was just one of those things on my list of like, I got to learn about this someday, but it's an impossibly rich topic. And I mean, I remember when I was first dating the woman who ultimately became my wife, right? The classic scenario, you're in a restaurant and you put this book down in front of you and you're like, what am I supposed to order? And, don't go most expensive, don't go least expensive. What are you going to have for dinner? How do I pair this? And it's just too hard until you know about it. And at that point, then the complexity becomes fun. But CellarTracker, was literally just a trip to Italy was the breaking point, and a tasting of 4 Sangiovese based wines that I assumed would all taste identical and were completely distinct. And then I just came home and was like, all right, I'm going to start buying wine. And 2 bottles turned into 20, turned into 200.
That wine travel thing is kind of a consistent thread that people like spark onto it. For me, I had a little bit of that as well. But as I've been talking to people in the industry, it's so interesting that so many of these people came from creative endeavors, came from music, came from other stuff. You, on the other hand, had a tech background. So let's talk a little bit about kind of this other direction. You back then you were at Microsoft, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about how wine fit into that culture, if at all, and kind of a professional level, and like what was happening back in those days with your wine tasting.
Yeah, wine was. I had a couple of friends or coworkers that I knew were kind of into wine. But on the whole, it was mostly I worked on. So I was at Microsoft from 1992 until 2005, mostly on Microsoft Word and then on Office, and I spent 1 year in Windows. Um, and CellarTracker happened because of a sort of an interesting accident of timing and sort of my mindset and approaching the world. But really, what I like to say is two things happened in 1999. One, I almost left Microsoft to go to Amazon, and I ended up staying and starting a team where we were challenged to use the internet to bring Office closer to our customers. And so I was sort of starting this team out with sort of almost like a little teeny skunk works. I had like two developers, and one of the developers had this crazy idea for how to just make software crashes go away. And he literally, I remember I sat down with him one day in the cafeteria, and he started going off on this thing, and I'm like, that's insane, but sounds cool. Um, and and I ended up, when I decided not to leave Microsoft, ended up running the team that he was on. And so over the next 6 years, we built out this thing. So if you ever saw when software would crash, it would pop up and say, send error report or don't send. Most people, about 85% of people would say don't send, which was fine, but 15% sent it. And so we got millions and millions and billions of these reports. But what was actually happening is people were voting for their crashes. And so we took something that was seemingly unstructurable software failure and were able to reduce it down to the fact that 70% of the crashes that people were hitting were 1% of the defects. And we found the magic way to find those things and fix them. And so within 5 years, building this tool set out allowed us to wipe out 95% of the crashes for all of the Office software without stopping everything, but just through the normal course of business. So it was amazing. So anyway, this was the beginning of 6 years of me thinking about data and the internet and again, sort of a whole different mindset. I had not worked professionally on those kinds of things. Same exact time that about 6 months after I started working on this project, my wife and I went on a bicycling trip in Tuscany, not really a pure wine trip, but just a trip where there was going to be food and wine. And it's basically you bike from place to place to place to place across the course of a week. Turns out if you're going to go to some place that's a good wine region, Tuscany is about as nice as they come. Also because the traditional foods and the traditional wines there, it's just magic. But I remember on the second night of the trip, them pouring just a little tasting of 4 wines: a Chianti Classico Reserva, a Vino Nobile de Montepulciano, and a Brunello de Montalcino. And we ended up over the next few days biking to both Montepulciano and Montalcino. In Tuscany, everything's a town on top of a hill, so you earn your way there. And it was great. And so I came home from this trip. I was just on fire. And one of the people I worked with at Microsoft, who was kind of the main wine person I knew, I went to Antoine and I said, Antoine, how do I do this? How do I learn about wine? And his advice was basically, I boiled down to 2 words, was pay attention. And what he was suggesting to me was I literally get a paper notebook and just don't open 1 bottle of wine at a time, open 2. So if I liked, Oregon Pinots, open 2 of them. Sorry, my phone is going to torture my watches. We're just going to turn off the binging. So, instead of opening, okay, if I like a particular Oregon Pinot Noir producer, don't just open 1, open 2, but make it 2 vintages of the same thing or 2 different vineyards from the same producer and just sort of compare. And so, that was the starting point. But what stuck with me was pay attention. And it got me to sort of, again, try to be more intentional about what I was tasting, what I was collecting, and trying to make sense of it. Now, keeping it in paper notebooks was a little unsatisfying. So ultimately, I was sort of tracking stuff in a spreadsheet. Spreadsheets aren't so great for it. So when I was on a sabbatical from Microsoft a few years later, I decided to do what any tech nerd would do, which was to create a website, a database-driven website on a server in my basement so I could get at it from home, from work, from my then very primitive Sony Ericsson web-enabled phone. This was very pre-smartphones, 2003. We didn't really get the iPhone until 2007 or 8.
Yeah. We were generally on BlackBerry if you were in the professional world. But yeah, the idea of sending kind of a call to a server so you could see something was probably a little adventurous at the time, although for somebody at Microsoft, maybe not. But for us, normal people.
Okay, so I was a tech geek sort of immersed in data and sort of applied some of the same mindset to sort of just my own wine collecting and tasting. When I ended up building this thing, the happy accident was I showed it to two friends who immediately said, "Oh, I want to use that," which I hadn't thought of, but then it made kind of perfect sense. And so, over the course of actually a plane flight, these two friends and I were at a culinary phase two of my sabbatical. Phase one, I basically spent 3 weeks building what became CellarTracker. Phase two, I did a 1 week culinary boot camp at the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York, where they had us cooking or in the kitchen or in lecture or wine tasting like 20 hours a day. It was brutal. It was fun, but it was like, so I brought my laptop thinking, okay, I'm going to work, I'm going to keep working on this website in my spare time. There was no spare time, but I showed it to the two friends who were like, I want to use that. So on the plane flight home, I like literally made it multi-user. Got two friends on there. And then I realized, oh, wow, this is interesting, because suddenly seeing each other's collections and then waking up each morning and seeing what the other guy had opened, and what they thought of it. And I just sort of realized, God, three people could be 300 or 3,000 or whatever. This is just interesting. So it's kind of tech geek turned wine geek. At the point I created CellarTracker, I was a few years into my wine bug. So I had about 700 or 800 bottles. And by the way, it's always one of the optional features of the site is you can barcode your bottles. And so when you add bottles to CellarTracker, there's a sequential ID. And so literally that first spreadsheet was bottles number 1 through 800 in CellarTracker. And so a year later, I created the barcoding feature. And so there's literally stickers on those bottles that have that number on there. So it's always a fun treat when I pull out a wine to open and it's like, number 227. I'm like, oh my God, it's one of the originals.
Well, that's good. I guess at least you get the power of having the original bottles. So at some point, this turns quickly from a kind of hobby to what grows into by far the industry standard for collectors to take care of their inventory, and quite frankly, a lot of professional storage and other people are using the tool. So talk to me about that transition, because that's always interesting, because it's like the growth of a business out of a hobby, I guess.
Yeah.
And so what happened?
So it's a little bit of an accident. So the day the day that CellarTracker first sort of breathed life was March 30 of 2003, and that was me putting the first tasting note on there. And then a couple weeks later is when I sort of had it up and running with a few of us. So I finished my sabbatical. I go back to work at Microsoft. I'm running a team of 25. I've created this thing. I ended up posting at some point on some wine bulletin boards, and so the three of us had turned into 60 of us, and over the course of a year, about 100 of us tracking 1 million bottles. And I'm trying to figure out, is this a hobby? Is it a business? And so my pattern was I would take 2 nights a week and stay up literally all night till 3 or 4 a.m. writing code, and then go into work in the morning and do a job at Microsoft that's keeping me pretty busy. For whatever reason, I loved Microsoft. It was absolutely working there from throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s. This was again during sort of the move from like when I arrived, it was the word perfect battle, and you had Lotus 1-2-3 versus Excel, so the early PC industry, and then the transition to Windows, and then the transition to Office, and then Windows 95, and then the rise of the internet, and then the rise of the smartphone was coming along a little later. Like there were just so many things happening. But in that last year, I also had started building a family, and so I remember I'd be going to work, and my son would be asleep. I'd come home, my son would be asleep, and I'm like, and meanwhile, I was living in downtown Seattle and then commuting to Redmond. And so I could spend an hour and a half a day in horrible traffic on the 520 bridge. And I was just like, at some point, my heart wasn't in it the same way it had been, at which point I knew it's time to leave. I didn't want to be that person just there hanging on. So many amazing people I worked with at Microsoft. So I was like, okay, time to exit the scene. And CellarTracker was a thing that I knew would keep me busy and get me out of my pajamas every morning so my wife wouldn't yell at me. I didn't know, was it a business or a hobby? I also knew that at that point. So I launched it still at Microsoft publicly in April of 2004, April 25th. And then, 10 people a day would sign up, 100 people a day would sign up. It just started growing and growing and growing. And so I ended up leaving Microsoft, my last day going into work was August of 2004. They didn't want me to leave, so we did a 5-month game where they had me take an unpaid leave of absence, so that if I got bored, I could change my mind and come back.
Right.
So that was very nice of them. So anyway, all that to say, but I knew once I left, I was done, and I was trying to figure out: is this a business? Is it a hobby? At a minimum, I wanted it to be self-sustaining because people had at that point put millions of bottles into the system and had spent in some cases dozens to hundreds of hours. So I didn't want to screw that up for people. So at a minimum, it needed to generate enough revenue so it could pay for itself. And what I figured at the time was, I'll play with this for 2 or 3 years and see if it's a thing, and if not, I'll go back to some very different role at Microsoft, or maybe go to Amazon, who I had turned down a few years earlier, so 23 years later, obviously I never went back, and I'm still here peeling the onion. And I figured out, oh, it is a business, and it's a really interesting one. And so I've just been trying to catch up ever since.
Yeah, so this, for a very long time, the business model was kind of a suggested donation model.
Yeah,
And that was obviously for the hardcore collectors was very appealing. At some point, you've obviously had to professionalize it a little bit and,
a
have
little bit, a little bit. We've
pricing.
evolved the language. So yeah, when I first started, um, it was more akin to sort of shareware at the very beginning, but pretty very quickly moved to a business term that was created a couple of years later called a freemium business model. So, and CellarTracker is this to this day. So there's a very full-featured free version of the site, and if you subscribe, then you get extra functionality and data. And so that was the model I had all along. I had some weird twists to it. I didn't call it subscription because people didn't really do that in software then, number one. Number two, I called it voluntary payment, and I suggested what people should pay based on the size of their collection, but it was a pretty much pay what you want. And whether you paid the minimum or some much larger amount, you got exactly the same functionality. So it was a pure honor system kind of thing. So a few years ago, actually went and interviewed 100 people, both people who were paying and people who were using the site every day but not paying, and asked them, why are you paying? Why aren't you paying? Do you know what you get for paying, etc.? It turns out one person out of 100 who was paying actually knew what they got for paying. Pretty much everyone else was like, well, I really like this thing and I want to support it. And then for the people who weren't paying, generally they were like, well, if I don't have to pay for something, I'm not going to pay for it. But also the value proposition wasn't particularly clear to them. And to a person, everyone was completely confused by the voluntary payment model. They didn't understand what that meant. So anyway, a couple of years ago, we took away the ability to write in completely arbitrary amounts, and we just have set amounts that are more firmly suggested based on the size of your collection. You can actually you still can change it. You can say, see other options, and you can pick a smaller amount, and there's no penalties. We don't enforce, even if you're paying for 100 bottles, you can track 100,000 bottles. Like we don't, we just felt like, okay, let's be firmer about this. And most people adhere to the suggestions who do choose to pay, which is great. And we did do one thing, which is, and you guys to do this once. We took some things. We did look very carefully at sort of the value propositions on the site, and for the people who were supporting the site, like what features were most important. So we took a few things like drinking windows and the ability to print a restaurant style wine list, and we said, hey, subscribers get that, and the free version doesn't get those things. So and what we've obviously focused on continuing to evolve the site, built a new, an app that everyone can use for free. And yet we're very focused on increasing value for the people who do choose to subscribe. Because at the end of the day, it's a business. And also the way I view it is, hey, the more people who subscribe, the more wonderful engineers who I can go and hire. And then the more we can innovate and do more interesting things, because that's my interest in this. Is I want to solve more interesting problems for all of the collectors and wine enthusiasts out there who can benefit from CellarTracker and the wisdom of this community. But to do that, I need really smart developers to do that, and they need paychecks, kind of things.
So one thing that you were just talking about, which kind of clicked for me, was the wisdom of this community, especially somebody who started watching, their father probably read the paper copy of Wine Advocate, I assume, is how much the community, especially on CellarTracker, although there's obviously other places, has really begun to shape the world of wine. In other words, we have kind of critics all over the place now, as opposed to just a couple. But how important these kind of community reviews are, the wisdom, as you called it, of that. How have you seen that develop over the last 25, almost 25 years now?
Yeah, I mean, look, that was, I think, one of the key original inspirations when I was creating CellarTracker. Was I created it as a tool. Again, I had been working on Microsoft Office in some capacity for 12 of my previous 13 years. So there's a saying, if you have a hammer, the world looks like a nail. So I was approaching this initially as a productivity tool for a wine collector. But that was the initial insight once I had 3 friends on there, which was the information that you could generate about what people were drinking and when to drink them, and the notes were so interesting. So even as I built it out as a productivity tool, from day one, the primary emphasis, there's private places you can leave notes, but the most attractive place that we push people to leave a note is to make it public. And we try to make it obvious to people, hey, you leave a note here, you leave a score, it's public. But we wanted to build a community where people were sharing with each other what they thought of the wines, because I thought that would inherently be interesting. And so I figured, hey, if we do this for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, at some point, it might, matter to people outside of the community. So that was the biggest surprise of CellarTracker super early on. So about a year in 2005, for the first time, still on a web server in my basement, I grabbed some tools to actually go and analyze the traffic for the first time, because this predates Google Analytics and magic things to see how much traffic and where it's coming from, et cetera. Anyway, lo and behold, I was stunned to find that more than half the traffic at that point was coming from people who weren't even registered on the site. This is basically sort of anonymous or guest traffic. And this was at a point when we had about 20,000 wine reviews on the site. Now we're at 12 million and counting. To fast forward to today, we get about 10 million annual visitors. If you Google a wine, CellarTracker is usually one of the first things that comes up, because this relatively small community of 1.1 million registered users has generated, again, more than 10 million notes on more than 5 million wines. And there's a lot of other information there, drinking windows and what people are paying, and on and on and on. And so I leaned into, from the very outset, that the real value of CellarTracker was the community. It wasn't about me or my software. I was creating the playground with kind of, the rules were posted, but I wanted to create a sort of a civil community where people came and they both tracked their cellar, but they were getting all this other benefit and information. And the stickiness of bringing all of those collectors together who had, if you've spent 5 hours cataloging your wine collection, you've got a pretty strong incentive when you open a bottle to go back and mark that off. And then, maybe it takes you a couple of seconds to write a review. And maybe that review is useful for you yourself to remember what you thought of the wine, but it's so useful for everybody else. So my goal always was to sort of create that flywheel, but built around just a really engaged, really authoritative audience of people who were very passionate about wine. And, the big secret of CellarTracker today is, yes, it's a cellar management tool, but the way that most people in the world use it is a tool for discovery, exploration, research, figuring out what to buy. Many of them are collectors, but they're not tracking their own cellars. They're just using CellarTracker to figure out, what wines they should go and get.
Yeah. And so, part of the reason that I wanted to talk to you, the idea behind this podcast series is really exploring, in the wine industry, our issue collectively with reaching younger people. And there's a million reasons. Obviously, we know why we have problems doing that. Tech is obviously one of those bridges that bring young people in, where somebody who is from a generation ahead of you and I is probably still got their paper list of their wines and whatever. So talk to me a little bit about the younger people and what behaviors you see that maybe the wine industry could take something from, as you look at kind of this big pile of data and the changing of behaviors over, the last 20, 10, 5 years, what you see.
Yeah. So a couple of things. Just in general, forget wine, but in general, in consumer categories, it is the case that younger generations when they sort of are trying to figure out what they should buy, what they're interested in, etc., they don't look primarily to experts first. They primarily look to their peers. And you've seen this obviously with Amazon and many, many other sites where peer reviews are very powerful drivers of commerce in general. But I think it's especially the case with younger people. So that's just a general phenomena. I think also we have seen sort of both the not the rise and fall of professional wine critics, but I think we've seen a diversification, as you mentioned, of wine critics where 20 years ago, pretty much it was Parker and Spectator for the American audience, and they were super authoritative. And now there's, an amazing plethora of voices and different palettes. By the way, I always like to say that CellarTracker has 12 million community reviews. We have 2 million professional reviews from 30 different publications. They're not free, but I've brought all of that information together so that if you subscribe to those other publications, you can flip on that channel and get additional value out of subscribing to Antonio Galloni because you see it on his site and on CellarTracker as long as you're a subscriber. Because I think the professionals have a lot of value to bring to the conversation, but there's just a lot of people who aren't going to go and spend $100 a year to subscribe to a professional publication, especially if they can get a lot of great reviews from very engaged enthusiasts. So that's thing one. Thing two is I think what you see in the power of a community is so professional wine critics, globally are reviewing generally the same 30,000 wines every year. The CellarTracker community is reviewing hundreds of thousands of distinct wines every year. There is a very long tail of interesting wines out there. And obviously sort of the higher end stuff is going to get visited by professionals, but otherwise there's kind of no one saying anything out there about them other than people who are passionate, collectors and consumers. But also as consumers, we're consuming wine in kind of the way it's intended to be consumed. We're opening it up with friends and having it over dinner over the course of a few hours, right? Versus a critic might be tasting 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 wines in a day, machine gun style. And so, I'm amazed many of them are incredibly skilled at being able to discern which wines can stand out. But I think it is also definitely the case. And I think you saw this with Parker, where it felt like a lot of people that increasingly towards the tail end of his career, the wines that he liked the most were the ones that were just the biggest and the boldest and kind of stood out from the crowd in what was inherently an unnatural way of reviewing a wine. Reviewing it wasn't like consuming it. All that to say, back to young people. Wine has one other problem, apart from, say, traditional gatekeepers. It is, I have a theory that in life, that if you look at any given thing, a person, a category, whatever it might be, their greatest strength and greatest weakness are a double-edged sword. So wine's greatest strength is it is endless diversity and subjectivity. I don't know. I didn't look at your collection, so I don't know. And if it were private, I wouldn't look. But so I don't know what you like versus what I like. Like we might like some of the same things. We might like completely distinct things. But as you know, we're not wrong. We like what we like. I mean, we could argue if we're drinking the same wine and it's chemically flawed, it's corked. That's objective. That's a failure. But subjectively, we may just want something completely different, and neither is right or wrong. We're just pursuing different wines. So when you're trying to get into this vast universe where there's 250,000 collectible wines released every year, there's just so much out there. And you're, unless you've had someone, my dad didn't really teach me much about wine, but at least he exposed me to it a bit. I think what historically you saw was that people did learn about wine sort of in their family and at the table, and had some sort of training wheels that way. It was made less scary. But anyway, all that to say, I'm tasting a wine. If I don't know anything about it, I remember this in my 20s. I was like, I think I like it. Am I supposed to like it? Is this good or is this bad? Right. So how do you help people? And then not even knowing what is the difference between a Pinot Noir and a Chateauneuf de Pape, right? Or that, I just said the name of a grape and the name of an appellation, and those are different things, although they're in some ways a little bit synonymous. But there's so much nomenclature and so much complexity and diversity. So that makes it scary. Now, the moment you know a little bit, that's what makes it so unbelievably fun, right? And I'm at a point right now in my collecting where I've got the areas where I'm really deep, but I'm trying to branch out into other areas, Alto Piemonte and Loire Reds and Loire White. So for whatever reason, I used to never like Chenin Blanc, and now all of a sudden I like it. So I'm like, okay, I don't know what was wrong with me 20 years ago, but
Yeah, well, but
no,
that changes a lot too, right? I mean, obviously, one
yeah,
of
our
the
palates
fun
have
things
evolved.
about
Yeah.
wine is that we lock on to something we like to explore, and so I don't really
So anyway, all
blame
that to
you.
say, let me wrap up the long thread
Yeah.
here, which is I think in general, to bring younger people in, we need to make wine more approachable, less scary, meet people where they are, but not simplify it and dumb it down. But it's just about how do you instill confidence in people, no matter where they are. And I think also for young people in general, they are more technologically adept, more likely to look to technology. Although my advice always, apart from using technology, is find a really good wine retailer. You can tell, by the way, I have an analog phone that's decided to chime in on the podcast here. Um, so anyway, I think wine has an approachability problem, but that's why I'm actually very bullish about technology, because I think it can help open the category up to a lot more people.
Yeah, one of the obvious kind of topics that we have to touch on that you guys have been focused on for a bit now is AI and kind of the emergence of the way in which people like to interact both with their own collection but also their exploration. So, talk to me a little bit about your philosophy on AI and what you are seeing on your end, like whether it's making your life um, easier as somebody who runs a tech company, or whether you're finding that it is creating a whole other set of problems, like maybe that we touched on prior to hitting record, with kind of the ability for there to be much more automated attacks on your system and other stuff like that.
Look, AI. I've been building technology for a while now, so I've sort of seen, um, the internet wave, the smartphone wave, and now this AI wave. Although I will say I studied computer science briefly in college, although my degree is in history, and so the dawn of AI, you got to go back to like the 1940s and Alan Turing, and was the concepts were there. But what we're seeing in the last 2 years is a commercialization of these tool sets in a way that's almost unimaginable. I will say separately, on my CellarTracker journey, one of my frustrations as I've sort of scaled the company over time is that I'm not doing enough with the data that people are putting on the site to turn around and make it incredibly useful to you, to help you better manage your collection, to help you better manage your buying, your consumption, every aspect of what you're doing. And I've been, so it's been on my list of like, oh my God, I need a data scientist. I need some way to extract all this wisdom and make it useful, to create more useful insights. So all that to say, boom, this AI thing comes along. And so I like to glibly say it's a really great time to have spent the last 23 years building an interesting proprietary data set. Because first and foremost, I view, from where I sit as a software developer and someone running a technology company, AI is a remarkably powerful tool set used in the right way to both take the wisdom of a fairly small audience of 1 million people on CellarTracker and make that wisdom much more accessible to hopefully about 100 million people out there who are very curious about wine and regularly buy and consume it. So that's thing one. Thing two, turning it around to use the AI to personalize the experience much more for each individual user in a way that is really smart and deep and insightful. AI also in other ways, it is a very powerful tool set. So it's very good, for example, at summarization. So if I go to a page on CellarTracker, and there's 1,000 reviews on a wine, I don't know about you, I may read the first 4 or 5. Maybe if there's 20, I kind of scan through all of them or whatever. But so we're about to launch a version. We've been working on our new app for the last 2 years. We throw a new version out about every 3 to 4 weeks. So the next version that's in test flight right now and should be in the store, knock on wood, in another week, is the first one. And we've been working on a bunch of AI features for the last year that are in the product but are pretty buried. And a bunch of those features are going to pop up to the top of the page literally in the next 2 weeks. And one of them is, when I go to a page and I'm looking at all the tasting notes, lo and behold, the AI is going to read all the notes and it's going to summarize, hey, here's what here is what members say, here's what the community thinks about this wine, here's recent trends, here's what people like, here's what they don't like. But if you go to, let's say, the brand new vintage of a wine and there's absolutely no reviews, historically, CellarTracker, we would just say no reviews. So the AI, it's like, hey, that's okay. I'll go read the reviews from the other vintages, within 3 or 4 years in either direction, and I'll extrapolate what I'm seeing there together with what I know about those vintages overall, and I'll create something to say. And it's not the same as here's an actual review of someone who drank this wine yesterday, but the idea is to always have something to say about about the given wine, about the producer, about the vintage, and so it's incredibly powerful for doing that. So I'm really excited. It's also very good at tasting notes and even letting you chat with your cellar, to debate. Like, so most of the time now when I'm trying to figure out what to pair with dinner, I used to pull up the website. Now I'm chatting and like going back and forth with an AI agent and debating what wine I should open with dinner, which is ridiculously fun.
Yeah, I've noticed that that's a big trend, right? Which is the use generally of AI by people who are more casual consumers, especially with the wall of wines problem, right? And just like I don't even know where to start in this big box store or the supermarket or wherever where it's just like too much. And AI, I guess, does a better job than having nothing at all in that type of situation. I'd imagine for you, it's probably more just amusing than probably.
I think where it gets powerful is, so we're using AI in a way. So we're built on top of a bunch of even because of our Microsoft roots, on top of a lot of Microsoft technology, and so Microsoft has done, they're betting their whole company on AI, but their cloud hosting platform Azure, they do an incredible job. So all of the models for ChatGPT and DeepSeek and everything is there, but it's there behind Microsoft's privacy wall, so to speak. And so we can use basically ChatGPT, but not putting our data out into the public domain or giving it to OpenAI, and not putting user data out there in public ways. And so, when you go to wine and we want to answer the question for you, will I like this? We can train the AI very quickly with, well, what are the recent things you've purchased? What are the recent things you've thumbs up or thumbs down? And compare that to what we know generically about those wines and the wine you're looking at, and use your personal sort of your own intention and your own habits together with what we know about the wines to reach very personalized conclusions about what you might like, how to do different pairings, things like that. So the wall of wine problem, you can answer it generically. These are the most popular or the most highly rated, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But to answer them in a uniquely personal way, if you're doing that in a tool where it knows 10 wines that you like and 10 wines you don't like, you can reduce that wall problem down to, or say restaurant wine list problem down to, hey, there's 1,000 wines on this list. Here's 100 that probably are kind of in your wheel set, and here's 10 that are a good deal, and here's 5 that are going to pair with, if you tell us what you're going to have for dinner, here's the 5 that you want to look at, and this is the top pick kind of a thing. And so trying to create a magic moment where there's probably no bad answer, but actually getting to a really good answer. And back to the thing, if people are drinking less, help them drink better in ways that map to their palates so that those experiences are better.
So I'm going to let you go back to work.